for, and still in many countries also contributes the majority of food production at national level. And we're dealing in these smallholder systems often with chronic poverty and food insecurity. And a typical characteristic of smallholder farm households is that they are highly diverse. And this diversity makes it difficult to characterize and describe smallholder systems, to identify drivers and to quantify system interactions, and thereby to target interventions and also to measure change caused by those interventions or by intrinsic changes. And in my work, I try to find structure in the variability of all these farming systems and livelihoods. I try to understand systems functioning. And in recent work, I really try to quantify relationships between agriculture and welfare, with a special focus on food security. And not surprising, given the title of this presentation, we use farm household characterization data as our workhorse to achieve these objectives. The setup of our work, and also this will be reflected in this presentation, is that in first instance we put together a lot of existing data sets, collated a lot of existing data sets of household characterization, and what you could call the frustrations of doing that and trying to identify common indicators we could quantify across all of these existing data sets. We also developed new data collection tools. And the information we extract from existing data sets and from the newly collected data we use to perform targeting and prioritization type of exercises, perform impact assessments and trade-off analysis. So in first instance, our work on bringing together existing data sets. Here's our current database of data sets we have put together in sub-Saharan Africa. In a wide range of systems, we have now characterization data available. And what we try to do across all of those data is to define a common indicator of food security. That was really easy. That was really one step forward or two steps forward, one step back type of exercise. And in the end, we ended up with a relatively simple indicator we can quantify for each individual household. And here in this graph, you see an example of this type of analysis, where you see on the x-axis, you see 200 individual farm households in a site in Tanzania, Lushoto. And they are ordered along a score of our food security indicator. It's called food availability ratio. And it quantifies the potential ability of a house to generate enough food to feed the family. So like I said, this is in one site, 200 households on the x-axis, ordered along that indicator. And what you see is within that same site, an enormous variation in that food security score. And that variation is also accompanied by different strategies. And those different strategies are represented by the different colors. So for example, in green is the consumption of food crops. In blue is the sales of food crops. Pink is the sales of cash crops. What else? We have livestock in red, and livestock in orangey is the sales. And in black, it's off-farm income. Yeah, so you see within a site enormous variation in food security, and along that trend in food security, which often is accompanied by increase in productive resources, so farm size and livestock holdings, you see a complete shift in the farm orientation and the farm strategies they have. And this information, this type of variation we can quantify within a population, is really important for us to target interventions. So typically for the upper, relatively more food secure households, you're talking about market options, further production intensification, crop livestock integration, diversification that could be interesting for these type of households. For the middle ones, they're targeting really on food crop production intensification and opening up of market opportunities for these households. As for the most food insecure households, if you're looking at agricultural interventions, you're typically talking about problem alleviation. It's very difficult to get them food secure with agricultural interventions. And really to get them less poor and more food secure, you're talking typically about off-farm opportunities for that group of households. And these type of quantifications, this type of calculation, we can now do across the whole data set, and that gives us an enormous amount of information, not only within site in terms of targeting, but also across sites and also even on country-wide basis. An example of this is where we use the World Bank LSMS ISA data to perform countrywide analysis. Here we have two maps in Uganda of the productive resources. So on the left it's farm size, in blue relatively large farm sizes, in yellow relatively small. And on the right we have the livestock holdings per individual household. In blue again large, in yellow relatively small. So these are the productive resources, but we can also quantify the different activities and the different strategies that different farm households are following. So here again for Uganda, maps of on the left off-farm income, green more important, yellow, white less important, livestock production, what role does it play in the household, again green more important, yellow less important, and we can go to the individual crops as well. Banana here, sorghum, cassava, maize, and then you see much more clearer patterns across the country, in this case Uganda, driven by the agroecology. And this type of information, again, we can use for our type of targeting analysis and also for sensitivity analysis towards climate change. What happens for different crops and how does that potentially affect the different households across the country. And this work has been done together with Wageningen University and has been led by Janneke Wieger. So with these existing data sources, we have been able to work across scales using basically a bottom-up approach. We use farm household level information to quantify what is happening at local scales, try to determine the factors that drive variation at local scales, and thereby we can also quantify consequences at larger scales and take into account larger scale developments, for example, in market prices or climate change, to see again what is happening at the local scale. Okay, so a lot of work has been done into using and quantifying indicators across all of these existing data resources. And our findings were, okay, that with relatively simple indicators, we can already derive a lot of information. However, that was not easy because basically across projects, across institutions, there's no standardization or harmonization of household survey tools and the type of indicators that are being quantified. What we also found is that data use in existing surveys is extremely inefficient. A lot of data is collected, but only a limited part of that is being used. And that has strong consequences because we have found in recent work also that overly long surveys lead to strong compromises in terms of data quality. And if you go beyond, say, 1.5 hours per farm household, data quality generally goes down quite rapidly after that. That drove us to develop a relatively new survey tool, which we call ROMIS. It's a Rural Household Multiple Indicator Survey, where we harmonize indicators and we standardize the way they are collected and quantified in all of the applications. We try to collect data as efficiently as possible, so making use of modern technologies and advances in indicator development, and we aim for a maximum survey duration of about 1 hour per farm household. And while we harmonize and standardize, we also want to keep flexibility and adaptability, so a tool that can be used in many locations and in many project settings. So what we did is try to follow a very structured approach in terms of which type of information do we collect and which type of indicators do we want to quantify. So per livelihood, we want to have information about drivers and strategies, about their performance, and about their welfare. And typical information we collect on the drivers and strategies is at the level of the farm household characteristics, farm size, family size, livestock holdings, gender information, gender control information, livelihood information, okay, what's their market orientation, livestock orientation, what are their off-farm activities, and the agricultural system. We collect a lot of information about the crops and the livestock species and their productivity. At performance, we look at economic performance, income, value of farm production, off-farm income, and of course also the agricultural system, where we look at productivity indicators and quantify these. And the welfare indicators, we have a special focus around food security. So there we have a whole cluster of different indicators that quantify different aspects of food security. So we can also always triangulate information. We quantify indicators around poverty and also around environment. And you could say that sustainable farm production is also an indicator of welfare. And importantly, users can include in each application indicators and questions of their own interest. Yeah, so the scheme here represents what you could call the core of the ROMIS survey, and for each application, each different project, it is expanded with another set of indicators that is of special interest to the researcher or to the project that wants to use the survey tool. And in that way, we combine, you could say, standardization and harmonization, but still a large amount of flexibility for the users. So with this harmonized, but nevertheless flexible approach, we build up data sets. Database is growing rapidly. And also we build up libraries of surveys and survey modules, so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel each time when they want to develop a survey application. And importantly as well, because the information comes into the databases in a standardized way, we also have now developed a whole library of processing, analysis, and visualization code. And automatically, as data come in on our data servers, we can right away perform all kinds of standard analysis and indicator quantifications very quickly. So that speeds up the whole cycle of data collection, data cleaning, and producing results. We started this work about 1.5 to 2 years ago, and has been, from my perspective, actually quite a spontaneous uptake by different organizations and different partners. And we have now already collected information about 7,000 households in more than 16 countries and 35 sites with a range of different partners, both research-oriented and also development-oriented, using this tool. So that has been developing quite rapidly. I want to show you a couple of examples of the type of analysis we have been performing. We have done quite a wide range of work, focusing on farming system characterization, and like I showed before, quantification of the diversity of farm households. We have done a lot of work around determinant of food security, pathway analysis. I will show you something about that. Analysis of changes over time, and evaluation of interventions. So the first application I want to show you is analysis of household trajectories over time, where we did a survey in 2012 in several countries, and we revisited the same households in 2016, early 2017, and we really want to quantify and analyze how do farm livelihoods change over time. So what did we do? We revisited more than 600 households, both in 2012 and then again in 2016, 2017, in 4 contrasting sites in Kenya, northern Tanzania, and central Uganda. And to be able to analyze change over time, we defined groups along 2 thresholds. Yes or no, can you potentially achieve food security? And yes or no, can you get above the poverty threshold, where the poverty threshold is a much more stringent threshold than the food security threshold. So how do then those trajectory classes look like? These are the results. You get in the end 3 groups. So below the calorie line, calorie is used for the food security assessment. Then in between food security and poverty, and the households that are above the poverty line. And the same in 2016. And you can also see how those households, which part of the household is changing from groups from 2012 to 2016. So that in the end, we ended up with 7 groups. If you go from 2016 from the bottom up, you get the group that stayed food insecure and poor. Then you get the group that was relatively food secure in 2012, but became food insecure in 2016. Then you get the sort of median group, or then you get the rising group. So one of the rising groups that went from food insecure to relatively food secure, but still poor. Then you get the medium group that stayed sort of in between relatively food secure and poor, and remained there in 2016. Then you get the group that was above the poverty line but went down below the poverty line in 2016. A group that was below the poverty line in 2012 but went above the poverty line in 2016. And the relatively wealthy households that remained above the poverty line in both 2016 and 2012. Okay, this is a bit of an artificial grouping, you could say. So does that actually relate to other welfare indicators that were measured independently? So here we have on the x-axis in each of these box plots those 7 groups. So on the left, the most food insecure ones that stayed in food insecure, up until the right where you have the relatively wealthy households. And then we compare those groups to, okay, how do they perform in terms of HFAS, that's the Hunger and Food Insecurity Access Scale developed by USAID. And the higher the score, the more food insecure you are. So that there seems to be a relationship between our grouping and that indicator. But the relationships are even more strong when we look at PPIs, that's the poverty indicator, strong relationship between our grouping and poverty scaling they show. And the last one is HDDS, that's the household level diet diversity score in the worst seasons as the farmers define it. And then again on the y-axis you see the number of food groups within that dietary diversity score, and there's a strong relationship again between our grouping and household diet diversity score. And so that gives us trust that our grouping seems to be meaningful in terms of welfare and well-being indicators, not only focusing on calories and food availability, but also in terms of dietary diversity and poverty. Yeah? So that gives us quite a lot of trust in our grouping. And the question, of course, is what are those farmers doing? What are their livelihood strategies? So again, here a series of box plots, again on the x-axis, each time those 7 groups in the same order. And you see here 4 different strategies. So crop consumption on the upper left and crops sold. You see that the poorest households on the left of the plots are very much dependent on crop consumption. Yeah? So really subsistence oriented. While the households on the right are more linked to sales of crops. And very similar results for livestock consumption and livestock sold on the lower 2 graphs. But the biggest factor explaining the variation or the 7 groups we have defined is actually off-farm income. The households that stayed static low and fall below food security have basically no access to good off-farm income. The medium groups have medium access, but the rising ones, which is the second one from the right, and the high remain ones, so the relatively wealthy households, to a large extent depend on off-farm income. And off-farm income is really the driver of change in these systems. And if farmers don't have enough productive resources, so land, livestock holdings, to maintain their productivity and to maintain their livelihood, they're actually in quite a bit of risk to go down in terms of their welfare and in terms of their performance indicators, as these results show. And this grouping is also related to other factors, for example, the gender indicator here, female control over all the decision making over the benefits of different activities is also a strong, significant relationship between our grouping and that indicator, where especially also the poorest groups are, quite a lot of households are single women households. And it's also related to our grouping on the right to the greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the poorest, most food insecure households, they didn't have access to off-farm income. To make them food secure with agricultural interventions is very difficult, given the fact they have very little productive resources, limited amount of land, limited amount of livestock. So what can we do for those households, actually? So we did some recent work with Tree Aid, that's a British NGO, and they're promoting the use of non-timber forest products in several countries, and we did an exercise with our ROMIS tool in northern Ghana to assess the efficiency of that intervention. So here we have again that an analysis of the importance of different activities to the livelihoods expressed in the food security indicator, where here on the x-axis we've already grouped them in severely food insecure households, moderately food insecure households, and food secure in households. And in the different colors are the different activities. And the most important for this exercise is the non-timber forest product box. It's the most upper one box in purple, where you see that relatively that activity is very important for the severely food insecure households. Yeah, so with that intervention, which involves quite a lot of labor and quite a lot of work, so that there you're really targeting already the severely food insecure households. And can then further promotion of market valuation or market linkages of non-timber forest products make a difference for the forest households. We have this analysis where we compared the yearly income of the control group versus the beneficiary group within the exercise of 3.8. And there we see a significant increase in the income generated by non-timber forest products for the beneficiary group. And in absolute amounts, you're talking about $40, $50, so it's not a huge amount. But again, for that most food insecure group of households, it can really make a difference for their livelihood. And so with these type of interventions, you're really targeting that most vulnerable group of households. In new analysis as well, we try to dive in a little bit further in terms of these indicators, and especially dietary diversity and food security. So here an example of a recent application in Zambia led by the World Agroforestry Center in collaboration with Todd Rosenstock. He was leading this work, where we looked at the household dietary diversity score after the growing season, so after the harvest. And we looked at here on the x-axis the percentage of household consuming certain food groups, which are listed on the x-axis. Then here you see that quite a large group of households after the harvest is consuming a wide diversity of food groups. And these food groups are especially determined by on-farm production. The purchased part of the percentages shown here is relatively low. But this picture completely changes when you look at the household diversity score, what the farmers call the bad season. So that's normally at the end of the dry season, going into the growing season, when there's still nothing to harvest. Then suddenly you see certain food groups almost completely disappear. For example, fruits, legumes, a lot of the vegetables, and you see that especially the purchase part is becoming much more important. So the link between what farmers were producing and what they are eating in what they call the bad season is much weaker. The money trajectory, you could say, the cash trajectory of generating money and thereby being able to buy diverse foods is much more important in this part of the year. And this type of information we use to develop what we call pathway models. So we are very much interested in the drivers of what you can see here on the right of the scheme of food security and dietary diversity. So how are those factors determined by purchased food and subsistence-based food? And then again, how is subsistence food-based determined by agriculture production and the variety of agriculture activities? And when we look at purchased food, how is that determined by income, off-farm income and market orientation, thereby cash production based on farm-based income. Yeah, we're also very much interested here how these relationships are shaped by the context of the farming system, by the different farm livelihoods. For example, by a factor like women control over decision making. In general, we see in households with higher women control over decision making that the diversity of purchased foods goes up compared to more male-controlled, male-dominated households. And in this way, we try to disentangle the pathways in which we can achieve food security and dietary diversity. How do they differ for different farm households? How do they differ across different systems? Okay, so let me wrap up with a couple of key take-home messages. I guess several times during this presentation I've stressed really the importance of off-farm income. And what I didn't show in many of these analyses, but we've shown them in other work, is that off-farm income also drives often the investments of farmers on farm. And so there's a strong interaction what is happening in terms of off-farm activities and in terms of the ability, the potential of households to intensify production. Key message, of course, is that different interventions are attractive for different groups of farmers. Yeah, we're talking really about an interaction between resources times motivation. Yeah, and I hope to have shown that we think we have useful rapid data collection and analysis tools to gain quantitative information on this, and also to identify generic patterns across households and across household groups. Targeted M&E is very essential, monitoring and evaluation, that take into account the diversity of farm households and the different responses that different households are likely to show. Yeah, bulldozer approaches are likely not to work in these type of diverse systems. And from our perspective, this has strong consequences for the way you design surveys and the way we target different farm household groups. Like I've shown before, we analyzed systems in 2012 and 2016, and changes are going on very rapidly in these households. Within 3-4 years, 60-70% of these households are making significant changes to their livelihoods or to their farming system. And we're in a relatively exciting period here, because given all the current data resources we have available online, publicly available, we can really work across scales. Yeah, and we can really go beyond individual system studies, which are difficult to generalize, but we can go beyond single case studies and really look at generic patterns across countries, across regions, while still keeping an eye on the local variability. Okay, that's what I wanted to present to you all. Thanks for your attention.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Yes, thank you, Mark, for the presentation. Sorry, I was on mute, so I was speaking on mute for a while. That was a wonderful presentation, and thanks for presenting this new tool. I was really impressed how this tool answers not just some of the important issues about surveys in general, but also that it covers across the spectrum of not just agricultural production, but also market integration, nutrition, food security, poverty, and greenhouse gas emissions. So that makes it really useful, not just for research purposes, but also for implementations for development banks, such as the World Bank and the NGOs as well. Well, without further ado, I would like also to remind to our attendees that this is an opportunity to post our questions on the box on the right side of the panel. We will convey those questions to Mark, and we will discuss them with Mark as well. Well, we have already some questions. I would like to start with Lucique. Lucique is asking, who is classified as a smallholder farmer in your presentation, and what kind of farming systems are dominant? Lucique is also interested to know what type of grains, nuts, vegetables, legumes were dominant in the diets in the example that you presented, and if any of them were classified as drought tolerant.
That's a good question about the classification. There's a series of classification around, but typically what we do is go to certain regions, ask for the farm household population, lists of the farm household population, and take random samples from there. So within a site, we don't say you are not a smallholder or you are a smallholder, but we look at who is living in a region or in a site and select households from there. So sometimes we get quite large farmers, yeah, with a lot of land holdings, for example, more than 50 hectares or stuff like that, which are normally not considered, of course, to be smallholder farmers. But they are present in that population, and we are really interested in quantifying the variation within the diversity within farm household populations. Yeah, so we don't say a farm household has to be smaller than 2 hectares in terms of land holdings to be classified as a smallholder farmer and thereby to be included in our types of surveys. We don't do that. The other question is what kind of farming systems are dominant. Not sure what that question is targeting or what is it aiming at, but we are typically at this moment looking at mixed farming systems. That's really what our tool has been developed for and targeted for. In new applications, we're also looking at pastoral systems, but then we know that we have to adapt the tool and target the tool a bit more to get more information about the livestock side of things. Last question was about the diet. So what type of grains, nuts, vegetables, and legumes were dominant there? In those systems, we were typically looking at sorghum millet systems. So those you could quantify as drought tolerant, and some of the legumes as well. The vegetables, yeah, I wouldn't call them drought tolerant, no.
Thank you, Mark. So we have also another question. Did you have a chance to factor gender issues in this study? And if so, could you please provide us with some highlights?
Yes, so we also quantify a gender indicator, and that is trying to quantify sort of how much of the decision making over the benefits of different activities is male determined or female determined, or also in the hands of children. And so who's doing the selling of the crops, who's doing the selling of livestock products, who's determining what is being eaten and when and how much. So that we quantify and try to integrate that in an overall score that quantifies the relative contribution or the relative control of females over decision making. And it's a bit of a rough indicator. Well, it's a very rough indicator, but still it shows some clear patterns. Like everybody knows, if market orientation goes up, so if cash orientation becomes more important, we see that the female control factor goes down, so that men take over more control over those cash-oriented activities. And in recent work, while diving into more into the diet diversity scores, we also see that more female control over decision making also may results in higher HDDS scores, so higher dietary diversity scores. And then especially in the Zambia exercise and also in the recent Malawi exercise, we see that between groups where female control is larger and female control is lower, we see differences in especially the vegetables that are being purchased, and also meat purchases is different between those groups. So gender is really a very important factor that influences the different relationships we find between food security and egg production and egg cash generation.
Thank you. That was very clear. I have another question myself, and then again, I would like to invite our attendees to type their questions as well. As you know, Mark, many of the countries they are now in the process of implementing their INDCs, and many of our countries and clients talking on behalf of the World Bank, they are in the process of developing strategies specifically about agriculture in relation to INDCs. At the same time, the World Bank is also developing a series of what we call climate smart agriculture investment plans for countries. So my question would be, how do you see this survey tool that you have developed to be applied in either in the strategizing of or implementation of the INDCs at the country or subnational level?
Basically, there are two things there in terms of prioritization of the types that will be targeted. I would focus on reusing the existing data sets which we have now organized, so that can help prioritize and strategize sort of investment plans. So which farm groups are you targeting? What are the key crops? What are the key sensitivities? What type of population sizes are you talking about in the different regions? Their key activities, how much of those farms or those households are poor, yes or no, and what do you want to achieve for the different groups of households? And then in terms of evaluating the investment plans and see what is going on, what is changing, that where typically such a relatively rapid and light survey tool can help to see and to evaluate the efficiencies of certain investments.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Again, I don't see that many questions coming from our attendees, but perhaps another question would be in terms of scale. So how do you see any differentiations in implementing the tool at different scales? And I have in mind, for example, if you have a client that it really intends to develop a CSA investment strategy at the national level versus subnational level. How would you organize the resources, and what type of resources are needed to use this tool and do CSA prioritization and differentiate between the different scales?
That's a very good question. It's again about defining objectives. So which are the farm groups you want to target? Which types of changes in food security? Do you want to change national level food security? Do you want to change the food security of especially the urban population versus the rural population? One size fits all type of interventions don't exist. So we have to clarify very much what's the target population, and what are the aims. That will sort of determine which farm populations you will actually target in terms of the type of surveying and the type of quantifications and intervention analysis you would like to do. So if you're targeting the food security of the rural population, you're talking about the most food insecure households that we have surveyed here, and then you would, again, across contrasting systems, you would like to quantify what those farm households are doing, what are their key strategies, what are their key crops, what are the key dependencies, and you could quantify that, and that can help you to target your CSA planning. And again, like I said, we already have a lot of databases available, so we can start with work on that, and it doesn't mean a whole lot of new survey work in most countries. But if we're targeting, for example, the urban population, you're talking about a completely different type of intervention, because of course then you're looking at the farm households that are actually producing for the market and producing food that can become available for the urban population, and that is of course sort of the upper half of the farm household populations, like we have quantified and like I have shown those graphs. So that's a completely different type of aim and objective. It means that the type of intervention, the type of targeting for M&E and evaluating interventions has to be completely different as well.
Great, thank you very much. And perhaps the last question from my side before I can pass the floor to the audience. Reading your paper in the agricultural systems, again, I would like to remind our group today that this series of webinars, they were motivated by a series of papers that CCAFS and other partners recently published in CSA prioritization. So in that paper, you differentiate and comment a bit about differences that you found out between small farms and larger farms interventions. So I would like to ask you a bit to elaborate on this.
Yes, so there was again a key interaction with off-farm income. So the small farms needed basically the cash of generated by off-farm activities to be able to invest and to intensify their production. It was quite a strong relationship we saw in the two contrasting systems in Tanzania and in Guatemala. We analyzed with our survey tool. But in contrast, the larger farm households, which already had larger productivity, larger production, larger food security, there we saw a clear trade-off between the investments on the farm and the labor allocated to the farms and off-farm activities. So there, basically, for the larger farms, it really was a choice between either you start concentrating on off-farm activities and basically exiting farming and just using your farm on a low intensity level, versus intensifying production on your farm, increasing market orientation and farm-based income, and further developing your livelihood based on farm production. So there was a clear distinction we saw between small farms and large farms, and that pattern was visible both in Tanzania and in Guatemala and Central America.
Thank you, Mark. And if no other questions from the audience, I would like to thank again all the participants for joining our webinar today. A big thank you to you, Mark, for sharing this information and the recommendations. This webinar recording and materials will be available within the next week on the FARMD website. We will also send the materials to you directly by mail. If you like what you hear today, please join us for our next webinars. As I mentioned, this specific series of webinars, they have concluded with the webinar today by Mark, but new webinars, they might be coming soon in the future. Again, thank you all for participating, and thanks, Mark, for this opportunity to learn more about your research and the tools that you presented.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present.